Britain is a country of migrants.
In Britain, it was Tony Blair and his government which threw open the borders, pursuing a policy of mass immigration and kicking off the massive demographic changes we've seen in our nation over the past 20 years. As such, we often think of immigration as a left-wing thing, something a socialist should be supporting. Even today, the open borders crowd are all from the political camp which claims to be on the left. However, this glosses over the fact that the decision to radically change the demographics of Europe was not only a political move against their opponents, what Labour referred to as rubbing the right's nose in diversity, it was also an immense betrayal of those they claimed to be fighting for, the native working class. If being left-wing means helping the poor and standing up for the interests of the working class in your nation, then being left-wing goes hand in hand with resisting mass migration. This video explains why.
Unrestricted migration, and that is what this town overall voted Leave to stop. Yeah. That's what we wouldn't have in these working class traditional communities, and you're stabbing us in the back.
Round 1, fight!
Economist Paul Collier, in his book Exodus, points out that with the growth of the information economy, the returns to exceptional mental ability have increased. This is much the same hypothesis made by Charles Murray in the bell curve, that as technology advances, you'll see the increased stratification of society on the basis of IQ. The outcome of this development is rapidly widening social inequality. Many would like to reverse or at least limit this widening social inequality through redistribution, especially on the left. Here's the problem. Mass migration correlates negatively with willingness to redistribute wealth. In other words, if you're a left-winger, you must pick one: greater equality in your country or open borders, not both. For redistribution to be politically feasible, there must be enough fortunate people who are willing to subsidise the less fortunate. Higher earners must empathise with low earners. They must see them as themselves, but merely less fortunate. This empathy comes from a shared sense of identity, which in turn comes from common membership in a network of obligations, in having a shared past and viewing our destinies as entwined. Mass migration of culturally distant people disproportionately occupying low-income slots in the economy weakens this mechanism. High-income people identify less with low-income people and are thus less willing to make transfers to the less fortunate. This view is supported with empirical evidence. The recent phase of open-door migration in Britain has coincided with the collapse in willingness to fund redistribution. In 1991, a substantial majority, 58%, agreed that the government should spend more money on welfare benefits, even if that meant higher taxes. By 2012, this figure had dropped to a small minority of just 28%. California in the United States is another perfect case study of this effect. It has seen mass migration from Mexico since the 1960s, and this has coincided with a severe degradation in its public services and a tax strike by the higher income groups. On top of the theory and the empirical data, it's worth providing an illustrative analogy. Water flows from high points to low points naturally, and so is a good analogy for a modern welfare state which redistributes from high earners to low earners. A welfare state with no borders is as logically incomprehensible as a cup with no sides. Without containment, the water spreads infinitely, and no one will waste water filling it up. And who is hit hardest by this? The native working classes.
Round 2, fight!
Not only does immigration increase inequality by disincentivizing redistribution, it quite plainly harms the working class most in economic terms. From economic first principles, we would expect the immigration of workers to reduce wages and increase returns on capital. In other words, indigenous workers, the working class, are worse off, whilst indigenous wealth owners, capitalists, are better off. Doesn't sound like an outcome that Marx would be particularly happy with to me. Furthermore, the other main contributory adding to the economic well-being of your average household is government provisions, schools, roads, hospitals, and so on. Mass migration splits this stock of public capital between more and more people, and per capita provision deteriorates. The poor are most dependent on these government-provided services. Not only can they not simply opt for a private alternative, but those services make up a greater proportion of their overall economic well-being. So the reduction in their quality resulting from mass migration again hits the working class hardest. Finally, and this is a big one, housing. The effects of immigration on competition for social housing have been substantial. This is because not only are migrants poor, not only do migrants tend to have larger families, thus ranking more highly in the need for social housing, they also tend to concentrate in a few poor neighbourhoods. As Collier says, and I quote, "Past levels of immigration are likely to have had significant crowding out effects. Continued acceleration would potentially seriously reduce the access of the indigenous poor to social housing."
Final round. Fight!
So far, I've been making economic arguments because that's become the only accepted way to defend working class interests. And the economic factors are important, but it pains me to do so because there is so much more to life and long-term well-being than money. After all, Judas was paid. Do you really think the working class care about 15 pence more an hour for a skillless dead-end job funded by some soulless multinational? Do you really think the working class care for the chance to collect a few more pounds from the benefit office each week? Do you really think the working class care about a few more scraps from the tables of finance in free school meals? No. What the working class has lost, and what the modern, multicultural left will never give it back, is its pride, its identity, and its nation. Mining, gone. Manufacturing, gone. The military, slashed. The white working class built this nation, and it's been taken away from them, not just metaphorically, but literally, physically, street by street. By this point, every Briton knows that integration is a myth, and the phenomenon of white flight is rampant. It appears, as anyone with half a brain might have predicted, that people prefer to live in the majority amongst their own people, their own cultures, and by their own customs. The heat maps you're now seeing show major metropolitan areas across the United Kingdom, which at the time of the data's collection in 2011 had already been colonised. The large areas of pale yellow are places where the population is now less than 10% white British. These are by and large working class areas. When Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 and spoke of one of his constituents who was discontented about being the only white Briton on her street, people said he was mad, over-exaggerating. As you can see, there are now whole neighbourhoods, whole city centres across our United Kingdom in which the population of white Britons are in single figures. Far from hyperbole, Powell's predictions were gravely understated, and this data is nearly a decade old. If you're left-wing, if you're middle class, if you're a professional, I want you to consider, if someone came to you and asked, would you like to live in an area where you share a history, a culture, and an ethnicity with just a few % of the other people who live there, and moreover, it is to be your hometown where you and generations upon generations before you lived and thrived that is to be radically transformed? Would you accept? Now understand the reality that for many, this has already happened. The only difference is that they were never asked. That is the plight of the white working class in many areas across our nation and across Europe. Further mass migration will only speed this tragic process of displacement and replacement of our native working class, and the left wing need to stop supporting it.
Finish him!
The sad truth is that the established left wing in the West hasn't cared about the native working class for some time now. Their game plan has always been to make their policies and positions irreversible. This has been done first by abandoning their base of the native working class in favour of the morally self-righteous middle class, who enjoy a warm fuzzy feeling from getting on their anti-racist high horse, safe in the knowledge that they have the resources to remove themselves from all the problems they refuse to acknowledge and which their multicultural politics is creating. Then, by the time the old working class has awakened to their betrayal, the left has already reinstated its new base from the immigrant-descended population which they have imported, and continue to import en masse. Indeed, as a recent Electoral Commission study has revealed, some 90% of black voters and 3/4 of Asian voters vote Labour. Far more consistent than the native working class ever were, the left has found another, more obedient pet to loyally put them in office, allowing them to continue their important long-term work of destroying the nation. In fact, I believe it's actually this insidious long-term leftist strategy of building voting blocks along ethnic lines, as instructed by their neo-Marxist doctrine of creating intersectional oppression narratives beyond the traditional class story to form a coalition against the will of the national majority, which has been the primary contributing factor in the rise of identitarianism in the West. In fewer words, as the fire rises, we find that it's the power-obsessed left who are the arsonists in this story. So let me conclude. If you're left-wing, and for you, that means you define your politics in wanting to help the native working class in our nation, stop advocating for their replacement. Instead, help end and reverse mass migration.
I want to tell you something. Every single person here, do you know what we are? We're the backbone of this country.
Flawless victory.
I want you to smash that like button. Smash that like button. We need 3 million likes. Smash that like button.